It started as just another Tuesday in September, with the crisp autumn air of Boston wrapping around me as I walked my daughters, Emma and Sophie, to school. The maple trees along Beacon Street were just beginning to turn golden, and I remember thinking how beautiful the season would be. I had my usual morning routine planned, a quick stop at my favorite coffee shop on Newbury Street, then heading to my office in the financial district where a stack of accounting reports awaited my attention. The pain hit me like a lightning bolt just as I was reaching for my second cup of coffee. At first, I tried to brush it off as nothing serious. We Bostonians tend to be stubborn that way. But within minutes, I found myself doubled over at my desk, barely able to breathe. My colleague Sarah's face turned pale when she found me, and I still remember her steady voice calling 911 while holding my hand. The ride to Massachusetts General Hospital was a blur of sirens and concerned faces. The EMTs kept asking me questions, but all I could think about was who would pick up Emma and Sophie from their after-school activities. Emma had ballet at 4, and Sophie was supposed to have her piano lesson with Mrs. Rodriguez at 5. The thought of my girls waiting, worried and confused, made the pain in my abdomen feel even more unbearable. In the emergency room, everything moved at a dizzying pace. Dr. Thompson, a tall woman with kind eyes and graying hair, explained that I needed emergency surgery for what appeared to be a ruptured appendix. The situation was critical, she said, and there was no time to waste. I tried to focus on her words, but my mind kept drifting to the mountain of responsibilities I was leaving behind. As a single mother, I was the sole keeper of our family's intricate schedule, the only one who knew that Sophie needed her inhaler before gym class or that Emma was allergic to the cafeteria's Thursday lasagna. Through the haze of mounting pain and anxiety, I managed to call my parents' house in Cambridge. Mom answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful as always, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding. "Martha," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need your help. I'm at Mass General, and they're taking me into surgery." I explained about the girls, about the activities they needed to be picked up from, about the spare key under the pot of geraniums on my front porch. The fluorescent lights in the pre-op room cast strange shadows on the ceiling as I lay there, my thoughts scattered like autumn leaves in the wind. The nurse, Tom, was trying to distract me with stories about his golden retriever while inserting my 4, but I couldn't shake the feeling of profound loneliness that was settling over me like a heavy blanket. Despite living in a city of millions, despite having family just across the Charles River, I felt utterly alone. As the anesthesia began to take hold, memories floated through my mind like fragments of a dream. I thought about the morning school run, how Sophie had insisted on wearing her red polka rain boots despite the clear sky, and how Emma had given me an extra tight hug for no particular reason. I thought about the unfinished report on my desk, the laundry I hadn't folded, and the parent-teacher conference scheduled for next week. Each responsibility seemed to weigh on me, even as consciousness began to slip away. The last thing I remember before the darkness took over was a sudden, crystal-clear realization that my life was built on a foundation far more fragile than I'd ever acknowledged. The careful balance I maintained between work and motherhood, between independence and family ties, between strength and vulnerability, it all seemed to be crumbling under the harsh hospital lights. As my eyes grew heavy, I couldn't shake the feeling that this medical emergency would expose cracks in my life that I had been carefully papering over for years. In that moment of clarity before unconsciousness claimed me, I thought about all the times I'd prided myself on being self-sufficient, on never asking for help, on being both mother and father to my girls since Mark's death 3 years ago. Now, lying here in a hospital gown, I was being forced to rely on others, to trust that my carefully constructed world wouldn't fall apart in my absence. The irony wasn't lost on me, even as the drugs pulled me under. The beeping of monitors and the murmur of medical staff faded away, replaced by a deep silence. As I drifted off, I caught fragments of conversation, someone mentioning blood pressure, another voice calling for additional units of plasma. In my last moments of awareness, I found myself making deals with whatever higher power might be listening. Let me survive this, I thought. Let me make it back to my girls. Let me have the chance to rebuild whatever breaks in my absence. Then everything went black and I knew nothing more. The first few days after surgery passed in a haze of pain medication and fitful sleep. When I finally gained enough clarity to check my phone, I found a string of missed calls from Emma and Sophie's school, but surprisingly few from my parents. The girls, I learned, had been taken in by our neighbor Karen, who'd received a hasty text from my mother saying she and Dad couldn't make it that day. The truth emerged in pieces, like a puzzle I didn't want to complete. While I lay in recovery, fighting infection and barely able to move, my parents had decided to keep their tickets to Hamilton at the Colonial Theater. We paid good money for those seats, Mom explained when she finally visited, 3 days after my surgery. And really, dear, you were in good hands with the doctors. Besides, Karen was happy to help with the girls. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes to keep myself from screaming. The same parents who had lectured me countless times about responsibility and family duty had chosen a Broadway show over their daughter and granddaughters in crisis. The irony was almost too much to bear. Recovery was brutal, not just physically but emotionally. Every movement sent sharp pains through my abdomen, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my heart when Emma and Sophie visited. They tried so hard to be brave, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Sophie, only 8, climbed carefully onto my bed and showed me the get well cards her 3rd grade class had made. Emma, at 12, was more reserved, but I caught her wiping away tears when she thought I wasn't looking. Karen brought them every day after school, juggling her own family responsibilities to help us. She'd pack them snacks, help with homework, and try to maintain some semblance of normalcy in their disrupted lives. Meanwhile, my parents called. Occasionally, always with excuses about why they couldn't help more. Dad was busy with his golf club committee, Mom had her book club and volunteer work at the MFA. Each excuse felt like another twist of the knife. The hospital's social worker, Maria, stopped by regularly to check on me. During one visit, she gently suggested that I might need more support once I was discharged. Recovery from abdominal surgery takes time, she explained, her dark eyes full of concern. You won't be able to drive for at least 2 weeks, and lifting anything heavier than a gallon of milk is out of the question. I nodded, knowing she was right, but the thought of asking my parents for help again made my stomach churn. One evening, as I was struggling with the hospital dinner, a sadly unidentifiable casserole, my mother called. We're thinking of taking a weekend trip to the Cape, she announced cheerfully. The weather's supposed to be lovely, and you know how beautiful Chatham is in the fall. I listened in disbelief as she detailed their planned getaway, not once asking about my recovery or the girls. The nights were the hardest. After visiting hours, when the hospital quieted except for the steady beeping of monitors and the squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway, loneliness would creep in like a physical presence. I thought about my childhood, about all the times my parents had preached about family being the cornerstone of life. Now, when I needed them most, they were showing me exactly where I stood in their priorities. My phone would light up with texts from Karen, sending photos of the girls doing homework or playing with her kids. She even managed to get Sophie to her soccer practice and Emma to her dance class, maintaining their routines as best she could. The contrast between her kindness and my parents' indifference couldn't have been starker. The physical therapist, Jack, started working with me on day 5, teaching me how to move without straining my incision. During our sessions, he shared stories about his own family, his sister who'd stepped up to help when he had knee surgery, his parents who drove 3 hours every weekend to support them. Each story was like salt in my wounds, highlighting what family support should look like. As I grew stronger physically, I felt something hardening inside me. The hurt was transforming into something else, a cold, clear anger that crystallized my thoughts. I started making plans, reaching out to other parents from the girls' schools to arrange carpools for when I got home. I called in favors from colleagues, set up grocery delivery services, and researched home health aides. I was building a support system that didn't include my parents. One afternoon, while I was doing my prescribed walking around the hospital floor, I overheard another patient talking with her family. They were arguing about who would take which shifts to ensure she was never alone during recovery. The sound of their bickering over who got to help, rather than who had to, brought tears to my eyes that I quickly wiped away. Dr. Thompson cleared me for discharge after 8 days, though she emphasized the need for support at home. When I mentioned that I'd hired a part-time maid, she frowned. "No family available?" she asked. I just shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. The look of concern on her face said everything about how unusual my situation was. The day I left the hospital, Karen and her husband Steve helped me settle back home. They'd cleaned the house, stocked the fridge, and even put fresh flowers on the kitchen table. The girls were ecstatic to have me back, though they'd been well coached about being gentle. As we sat together that evening, with Sophie carefully curled against my good side and Emma organizing my medication schedule with serious concentration, I made a silent vow. This experience had taught me something invaluable about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family, and I would never forget it. The October winds swept through Boston Common as I slowly rebuilt my strength, taking short walks that grew longer each day. My surgical wound was healing well, according to Dr. Thompson, but the emotional scars felt raw and permanent. Every morning, as I watched Emma and Sophie board their school bus from our brownstone's front steps, I found myself replaying the events of my hospitalization like a movie I couldn't turn off. The betrayal had settled into my bones, becoming part of my daily routine just like my morning coffee or the careful way I now had to move to avoid pulling at my stitches. It wasn't just about the theater tickets or the weekend in Chatham anymore. Those were merely symptoms of a deeper problem I'd been avoiding for years. My parents had always put their comfort first, but somehow I'd managed to excuse it, to normalize their behavior until this crisis stripped away all my carefully constructed rationalizations. Karen still checked in regularly, bringing homemade lasagna and staying for coffee while the girls did their homework at the kitchen table. During one of these visits, she carefully broached the subject of my parents. "Have they even seen the girls since you've been home?" she asked, stirring her coffee. I shook my head, watching Emma help Sophie with her math worksheet. The girls hadn't mentioned their grandparents much, and I wondered if they'd already learned to expect disappointment from that quarter. The autumn days grew shorter, and I found myself with too much time to think during my medical leave from work. I remembered countless instances throughout my life when my parents had chosen their own convenience over family obligations. The time they missed my college graduation because they'd already planned a cruise. The way they'd barely helped when Mark died, offering platitudes about staying strong, while leaving me to handle funeral arrangements and 2 grieving children alone. Sophie's 9th birthday approached, and she asked if we could have a small party at our house. As I helped her make invitations at our kitchen table, she hesitated before asking, "Should I make one for Grandma and Grandpa?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I watched her carefully printing names in her neat 3rd-grade handwriting, her face serious with concentration, and realized how deeply their absence affected her. "Honey," I said, choosing my words carefully, "why don't we invite Mrs. Rodriguez instead? She's been so nice about rescheduling your piano lessons." Sophie's face brightened immediately, and I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. At 9 years old, she was already learning to protect herself from disappointment. Emma was less subtle about her feelings. One evening, while we were cooking dinner together, she'd become my designated sous chef since I couldn't lift heavy pots. She suddenly said, "I hate how they treated you, Mom." She aggressively chopped carrots as she spoke. Karen's parents drive all the way from Springfield every other weekend to see her family. Why can't ours drive 15 minutes from Cambridge? I had no good answer for her. Instead, I watched her careful handling of the knife, noting how grown up she looked in that moment. At 12, she was already developing a strong sense of justice, of right and wrong. Part of me was proud of her clarity, while another part ached that she had to learn these harsh lessons so young. The physical therapy sessions continued twice a week, and Jack became an unexpected source of wisdom. During our exercises, he shared stories about his own family struggles with boundaries and expectations. "Sometimes," he said, as he helped me with stretching exercises, "the healthiest thing we can do is accept people for who they are, and then adjust our lives accordingly." His words stuck with me during my solitary evening walks along Commonwealth Avenue. The November air was getting colder, but I found the chill clarifying. I began to see how my parents' behavior during my crisis wasn't an aberration. It was simply the clearest expression of who they'd always been. The realization was both painful and liberating. My sister Rachel called from Seattle one evening, apologizing for not being able to help during my recovery. Unlike our parents, she had a valid reason. She was 7 months pregnant with a difficult pregnancy and couldn't travel. During our conversation, she shared her own struggles with our parents' self-absorption. "Remember my wedding?" she asked. "How they almost didn't come because Dad's golf tournament was the same weekend?" We laughed together, but it was a hollow sound. The girls and I developed new routines during my recovery. Every evening, we'd sit together in our living room, sharing the day's events. Emma would practice her violin while Sophie drew elaborate pictures, and I'd help with homework when needed. These quiet moments became our sanctuary, a time when the absence of extended family support didn't feel like a gaping wound. Thanksgiving approached, and with it came the traditional expectation of family gatherings. In previous years, we'd always gone to my parents' house in Cambridge, where Mom would serve her famous dry turkey and Dad would monopolize the conversation with stories about his latest real estate deals. This year, when they called with the usual invitation, I found myself hesitating. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "we're going to do something different this year." Karen and Steve invited us to join their family. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Mom said something about breaking tradition and family obligations, and I had to bite back a laugh at the irony. The decision to spend Thanksgiving with Karen's family felt like a turning point. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, backlit by the warm lights of our living room, with Emma and Sophie visible behind me, absorbed in their activities. The image struck me as a perfect metaphor. We were illuminated from within, by our own light, no longer waiting for warmth from those who had proven themselves unwilling to provide it. That night, after the girls were in bed, I sat in my favorite armchair by the window, watching the late-night traffic on Beacon Street. The weight of betrayal still sat heavy in my chest, but it was changing shape, becoming something more like resolve. I was learning that family isn't just about blood and obligation. It's about choice, about showing up, about putting love into action. Winter descended on Boston with unexpected ferocity that year. As December's snow blanketed Beacon Hill, I was finally back at work full-time, my physical recovery complete even if the emotional wounds still lingered. The holiday decorations along Newberry Street sparkled in the early darkness, but I felt oddly disconnected from the seasonal cheer. Our Thanksgiving with Karen's family had been wonderful, full of warmth, laughter, and genuine care, making the contrast with my own parents even starker. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I was helping Sophie practice for her winter piano recital when my phone lit up with my father's number. Something in his voice immediately told me this wasn't the usual perfunctory check-in. Mom had fallen on their icy driveway, he explained, his usual confidence replaced by a trembling uncertainty. She'd broken her hip and needed surgery. "We need your help," he said, the words seeming to cost him physically. "The doctor says she'll need extensive care during recovery, and I don't know how to handle all this." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here was my father, the successful real estate developer who'd always had everything under control, suddenly sounding lost and afraid. I sat at our kitchen table after the call, my hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea, thinking about choices and consequences. Emma found me there and, with the perceptiveness that sometimes startled me, asked, "They want you to help them, don't they?" When I nodded, she said simply, "Are you going to?" That was the question that kept me awake that night, staring at the shadows cast by streetlights on my bedroom ceiling. The practical part of me listed all the reasons to say no. My own recovery was still recent. I had the girls to take care of. Work was especially busy with year-end accounts. But there was something else, something that had crystallized during my own crisis, the understanding that choices reveal character. The next morning, I called my father back. My voice was calm and professional, the same tone I used with difficult clients at work. "I've made some calls," I told him. "There's an excellent home health care service that specializes in post-surgery recovery. I'll text you their information." They can provide round-the-clock care if needed. The silence on the other end was heavy with unspoken words. But we thought you would. He started, then stopped. I could picture him in their Cambridge house, probably standing by the bay window where he always took his calls, looking out at the snow-covered Harvard campus in the distance. "Martha, your mother needs family right now." Like I needed family 3 months ago? The words came out before I could stop them, but I didn't regret them. The service is very professional. They'll take excellent care of Mom. Better than I could, actually. They're trained for this kind of care. Over the next few weeks, my parents struggled to adjust to their new reality. Mom's surgery went well, but recovery was difficult. They hired the service I recommended, but they kept calling with questions, complaints, and thinly veiled requests for me to take over. Each time, I maintained my professional demeanor, offering practical solutions while maintaining firm boundaries. Emma and Sophie asked about their grandmother, showing more compassion than I sometimes felt capable of. We visited once, bringing flowers and a get-well card they'd made. The house I'd grown up in felt smaller somehow, and the sight of my mother in a hospital bed in the living room was disconcerting. She reached for me with a neediness I'd never seen before, but I kept a careful distance, helping to adjust her pillows while avoiding any deeper connection. The girls' school had their winter concert in mid-December. Sophie was performing a piano solo, and Emma had a violin piece with the orchestra. I didn't tell my parents about it, breaking our tradition of including them in such events. Instead, Karen and Steve came, bringing their kids and enough enthusiasm for a much larger family. Watching Sophie take her bow at the piano, her face glowing with pride as she searched for me in the audience, I knew I'd made the right choice. My father called again the day before Christmas Eve. The home health aide had called in sick, and they were struggling to manage. His voice had lost all its usual authority. He sounded old and frightened. "Please," he said, "we don't know what to do." I closed my eyes, remembering how it felt to lie in that hospital bed, waiting for help that never came. "I'll make some calls," I said finally. "There are services that provide emergency coverage." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for more. "Dad, I can't be your backup plan. I have my own family to take care of." The words were firm, but not cruel, a boundary drawn with chalk rather than carved in stone. That evening, as the girls and I decorated our Christmas tree, I found myself thinking about the nature of karma. Not in a mystical sense, but in the way life has of teaching us through reversal. My parents were experiencing exactly what they'd put me through: the vulnerability, the need for help, the sharp realization that family ties don't automatically guarantee support. Sophie hung her favorite ornament, a glass ballet slipper that had belonged to my grandmother, and asked, "Are we going to Grandma and Grandpa's for Christmas this year?" I helped her adjust the ornament so it caught the light better. "No, honey. This year we're going to make our own traditions." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and moved on to the next ornament. The new year approached, bringing with it my mother's slow recovery and my father's continuing struggles with their new reality. They'd had to hire additional help, spending money they'd always been proud of saving. Each time they called with updates, their voices carried a new understanding of dependency and need. I maintained my distance, not from a place of revenge, but from a position of self-preservation. I'd learned during my own recovery that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about showing up, about being there when it matters most. Karen and her family had shown me what that looked like. Now, as my parents faced their own crisis, I was showing them what their choices had taught me. Life settled into a new pattern. I focused on my girls, on our chosen family of friends and neighbors, on building the kind of support system I wanted my daughters to understand and expect. Sometimes, when I passed the turnoff to Cambridge on my commute, I felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt, not quite satisfaction. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from experiencing the consequences of our own actions. Spring came early to Boston that year, with cherry blossoms along the Esplanade opening weeks before their usual time. My mother had largely recovered from her hip surgery, though she now walked with a slight limp that the physical therapist said might be permanent. It was during this time of renewal that Karen, over one of our regular coffee meetings, gently suggested that perhaps it was time to have a real conversation with my parents. "You can't avoid them forever," she said, watching me stir my coffee at our favorite cafe on Charles Street. "And more importantly, maybe you shouldn't." She was right, of course. The weight of unspoken words had become its own kind of burden, and I knew that for my own peace of mind, I needed to face this head-on. I arranged to meet them at their house on a Saturday morning, after dropping the girls off at their activities, Emma at her violin lesson and Sophie at her friend Julia's house for a play date. The familiar drive to Cambridge felt different this time, heavy with purpose. The spring sunshine illuminated Harvard Yard as I passed, reminding me of countless family walks through the campus during my childhood. My parents were waiting in their living room, the same room where Mom had spent weeks recovering from her surgery. Dad had aged visibly over the past few months. His hair seemed whiter, his shoulders more stooped. Mom sat in her favorite armchair, her cane propped against the side, looking smaller than I remembered. "I think we need to talk," I began, sitting on the edge of the couch where I'd spent so many hours doing homework as a child. "Really talk about everything that's happened." The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken disappointments and misunderstandings. "When I needed you during my surgery," I continued, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands, "you chose to go to the theater instead. You chose a weekend in Chatham over helping with your granddaughters. I need to understand why." The words hung in the air between us, unavoidable now that they'd been spoken. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We didn't think it was that serious," he started, but Mom interrupted him. "No, Richard, that's not true." She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. "We were selfish. We've always been selfish, haven't we?" The admission, so unexpected, caught me off guard. I'd prepared for defensiveness, for justifications, for the usual deflections. Instead, my mother's words opened a floodgate of emotions I hadn't realized I was holding back. "Do you know what it felt like?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Lying in that hospital bed, wondering who would take care of my girls, knowing that my own parents, who live 15 minutes away, couldn't be bothered to help." The words poured out, years of hurt and disappointment finding their voice at last. I told them. About the nights in the hospital, about Karen stepping in to help, about how the girls had learned to stop expecting their grandparents to show up. I described the birthday parties they'd missed, the school events they'd skipped, the gradual erosion of trust and connection. And then I continued, "When you needed help, you expected me to drop everything and be there. As if the past didn't matter. As if your choices hadn't taught me exactly how much I could rely on you." My father stood up abruptly, walking to the window. "We never meant." He started, then stopped. "We never thought about it that way." He turned back to face me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression: shame. Mom reached for her cane, gripping it tightly. "When we needed help," she said slowly, "and you responded the way you did. It hurt. But it also made us understand, finally, what we'd done to you." She paused, looking down at her hands. "We've been terrible parents, haven't we? And even worse grandparents." The admission hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift inside me. The cold detachment I'd cultivated over the past months began to crack, revealing something more complicated underneath. I realized that my response to their crisis, while justified, had changed me in ways I wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I learned something from all this," I said, my voice softer now. "I learned that family isn't just about blood or obligation. It's about choices we make every day. Karen and Steve showed me that. Their kindness, their consistent support, that's what family should look like." We talked for hours, delving into patterns that had shaped our relationship for decades. My parents spoke about their own upbringing, about the emotional distance they'd inherited from their parents. I shared stories about the impact their choices had had on Emma and Sophie, about the girls' resilience and their growing understanding of what family truly means. As the conversation continued, I found myself examining my own transformation. The hurt child within me had wanted revenge, had taken satisfaction in their vulnerability during Mom's recovery. But the adult I was trying to be, the mother I wanted my daughters to emulate, knew that perpetuating cycles of emotional distance wasn't the answer. "I don't know if things can ever go back to how they were," I said finally, watching the afternoon light fade in the familiar room. "But maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we need to build something new, something more honest." My father nodded slowly. "We'd like that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you'll give us the chance." Mom added softly, "We'd like to try to be better, for you and for the girls." As I drove home later that day, crossing the Charles River back into Boston, I felt lighter somehow. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't and might never be completely, but because the truth had finally been spoken. The wound that had been festering beneath layers of politeness and avoidance had been exposed to the air, and with that exposure came the possibility of real healing. Emma was practicing her violin when I got home, the melodic sounds of Bach floating down from her room. Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table, her face scrunched in concentration. The sight of them, secure in their routines, in our home, in the life we'd built together, brought tears to my eyes. We had created our own definition of family, one built on love, presence, and conscious choice rather than mere obligation. The summer arrived in Boston with its characteristic humidity, bringing with it a season of gradual healing and cautious new beginnings. In the months following our confrontation, my parents had begun making small but consistent efforts to rebuild their relationships with us. It started with little things, birthday cards that arrived on time, phone calls to ask about the girls' activities, genuine interest in our daily lives. Each gesture felt like a tiny stone being added to a new foundation we were trying to build. Emma was the first to notice the change. One evening, as we sat on our small balcony enjoying the cooling air after a particularly hot day, she mentioned how Grandpa had actually stayed for her entire violin recital the previous weekend, instead of leaving early as he used to do. "He even asked my teacher about my progress," she said, a note of surprise still evident in her voice. "And he remembered what piece I was working on from last time." These small shifts in behavior rippled through our family dynamic like stones dropped in still water. Sophie began asking to visit their house more often, drawn by Mom's newfound patience in teaching her to bake the Swedish cookies that had been a family recipe for generations. It was during one of these baking sessions that my mother finally opened up about her own childhood, sharing stories about growing up in a household where emotional distance was the norm. "Your grandmother never hugged us," she told Sophie, showing her how to roll the dough into perfect circles. "She believed that too much affection would make children weak." She looked at me across the kitchen island, her eyes holding a new understanding. "I never wanted to be that way with you, Martha, but I suppose we often become what we're trying to avoid." The process of rebuilding trust was neither quick nor easy. There were setbacks, times when old patterns emerged, when my parents' self-absorption threatened to overshadow their progress. But unlike before, they now seemed aware of these moments, catching themselves and making conscious efforts to do better. Karen remained a steady presence in our lives, though her role evolved as my relationship with my parents slowly healed. Over coffee one morning at our favorite spot on Charles Street, she shared her own perspective on the changes she'd observed. "You're different too, you know," she said, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "You're softer somehow, but stronger at the same time." She was right. The experience had transformed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The cold detachment I'd adopted during my parents' crisis had gradually thawed, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of human fallibility, including my own. I'd learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing past behavior, but rather choosing to move forward with clear eyes and firm boundaries. Work provided its own lessons in this new approach to relationships. When one of my junior colleagues made a significant error that cost our firm a client, I found myself handling the situation with a balance of accountability and compassion that surprised even me. "You reminded me of Dad," Emma commented when I told her about it over dinner. "The new Dad, I mean. The one who actually listens now." The summer progressed, marked by small victories and occasional stumbles. My parents joined us for Sunday dinners more regularly, though we maintained our tradition of spending every other weekend with Karen's family. These gatherings became a study in contrasts, my parents learning to navigate their new role as more engaged grandparents, while Karen and Steve continued to demonstrate the natural, easy affection that had helped us through our darkest times. One particularly memorable evening, as we all sat in our backyard watching the kids play, my father turned to Karen and thanked her, really thanked her, for being there for us when he and Mom hadn't been. The moment was awkward but necessary, a public acknowledgement of past failures and gratitude for those who had filled the void. Sophie's 10th birthday party became a testament to how far we'd come. My parents arrived early to help with preparations, bringing not just presents, but their presence, fully engaged, helping to hang decorations and arrange food. Mom had remembered Sophie's favorite cake flavor without being reminded, and Dad had found a vintage music box that played the theme from Swan Lake, Sophie's current ballet obsession. The party itself was a blend of old and new family, Karen and Steve's kids mixing with Sophie's school friends, my parents chatting comfortably with other parents, Emma showing off her latest violin piece to an appreciative audience. Watching it all, I felt a deep sense of rightness, as if all the broken pieces of our family life had been reassembled into something different but whole. Later that night, after the guests had left and the girls were in bed, I found myself sitting on our front stoop, looking out at the quiet street. The evening air was heavy with the scent of blooming linden trees, and the distant sound of traffic on Starrow Drive provided a familiar urban lullaby. I thought about the journey we'd all taken, from crisis to confrontation to this tentative peace. The lessons learned had been profound. I discovered that resilience isn't just about surviving hardship, but about growing through it. The girls had learned about the complexity of family relationships, about forgiveness and boundaries, about the difference between blood ties and chosen connections. Even my parents, set in their ways for so many years, had shown that change is possible at any age if the motivation is strong enough. Fall approached, bringing with it new challenges and opportunities. Emma started middle school, tackling the transition with a confidence that made my heart swell. Sophie's piano playing improved dramatically under Mrs. Rodriguez's continued guidance, and she began talking about trying out for the youth orchestra. My parents, true to their word, attended every performance, every recital, every small milestone. Work life shifted too. I found myself taking on more mentoring roles, drawing on my experiences to help others navigate their own professional and personal challenges. The empathy I developed through our family crisis became an unexpected asset in my career, leading to deeper connections with colleagues and clients alike. One crisp October morning, almost exactly a year after my emergency surgery, I took a walk through the public garden with my mother. The leaves were turning, painting the park in shades of gold and crimson. We talked about the past year, about regrets and hopes, about the future we were trying to build. I think about that night at the theater sometimes, she said, pausing to watch a group of tourists pose with the make way for duckling statues. How different things might have been if we'd made another choice. She turned to me, her face showing the weight of understanding that had come too late. But maybe we needed to go through all of this to really change. I considered her words as we continued our walk. The path ahead of us was dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees, much like our relationship now, areas of brightness and shadow, but clearer than it had been before. Maybe I replied, the important thing is that we're all choosing to do better now. That evening, as I helped Emma with her homework and listened to Sophie practice her latest piano piece, I reflected on how our family had evolved. The crisis that had nearly torn us apart had instead forced us to confront long-standing patterns and make conscious choices about the kind of family we wanted to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Karen, sharing photos from our last weekend together. Her kindness, once a lifeline in our darkest moments, had become woven into the fabric of our daily lives. We'd learned that family could be both given and chosen, that love could be both inherited and cultivated. Looking around our home, I saw evidence of this blended family life everywhere. Sophie's artwork hung alongside professional family photos, Emma's violin case next to my father's old medical books that he'd finally shared with her, knowing her interest in science. The space felt full in a way it never had before, rich with the complexity of relationships that had been tested, broken, and carefully rebuilt. The girls and I still maintained our evening routine of sharing our days, but now the stories often included moments with their grandparents, genuine connections that were slowly replacing the old patterns of obligation and disappointment. Emma told us about Grandpa helping her with a science project, his engineering background finally being put to use in a way that mattered. Sophie bubbled over with excitement about the cookbook she and Grandma were creating together, filled with family recipes and the stories behind them. As winter approached again, bringing with it memories of last year's challenges, I found myself feeling grateful for the journey we'd taken. The hardships had carved new channels of understanding between us all, allowing for a deeper flow of emotion and connection. We weren't perfect. There were still moments of tension, times when old habits threatened to resurface, but we had developed tools to handle these challenges together. Karen often said that crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it. But I'd learned that it could also transform it, given enough time and willingness to change. The person I was now, more compassionate, more boundary-aware, more intentional in my relationships, had emerged from the crucible of that difficult time. My parents, too, had been transformed. Their weekly dinners with us became a time of genuine connection rather than mere obligation. They learned to listen more than they spoke, to show interest in the girls' lives beyond surface achievements, to be present in ways they'd never managed before. The change wasn't always smooth or consistent, but their effort was genuine and sustained. One evening, as snowflakes began to fall outside our windows, Emma asked if we could invite everyone over for an impromptu family gathering. My parents, Karen, and Steve's family, even Mrs. Rodriguez. As I watched them all arrive, shaking off snow and filling our home with warmth and laughter, I realized we had created something beautiful from the ashes of crisis. This was our new normal, a family expanded by choice, strengthened by adversity, and held together by conscious decision rather than mere obligation. The journey had been difficult, but the destination was worth every painful step. We had learned that love, like trust, must be earned and maintained through consistent action, and that family, in its truest form, is something we create together, day by day, choice by choice.